Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, will they stay or will they go? There are now just days until Britain decides once and for all if it wants to remain a part of the European Union. This week, a Brexit special and why people in the UK and all over the world should care.
A UK vote to exit the European Union could have significant economic repercussions.
Janet Yellen, the world's most powerful banker, is just one of many international voices calling for the status quo to remain. President Obama, Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, and President Xi Jinping of China have also voiced their views. We'll ask if they've got it right as we hear from both sides of the debate. And remember when Grexit was the buzzword in European circles? We'll ask the former Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis for his perspective on the root of the debate and what impact a Brexit could have on the future of the EU. So, for the third time in 3 years, citizens of the United Kingdom have a massive decision to make. In 2014, it was the Scottish independence referendum. Last year, it was a general election which cemented Conservative rule in the country. And now the EU referendum, the Brexit scenario, the prospect of the UK cutting formal ties with Europe. On the ballot paper, it's a simple in or out choice. But the arguments from both sides are making that simple choice quite complex, especially when you consider just what might be at risk. And I say might because really, we just don't know. What we do have is a lot of opinion, like the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which was set up to promote the economic and social well-being of people around the world. It says Brexit would have significant economic costs, not just for the UK and Europe, but for the rest of the world. A view shared by the Bank of England and the International Monetary Fund. The US Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen said a UK exit from the EU would likely affect market sentiment, and any negative reaction in European financial markets could affect US financial markets. Together, the US and the EU make up almost 50% of global stock market capitalisation and GDP. But all that talk from the Remain camp is being matched by the so-called Brexiteers, those who say leaving the Union will actually bring about some financial independence and stop millions of British pounds finding their way to Brussels. This week on Counting the Cost, we are all about the EU referendum, starting with this report from Jonah Hull in London on what's really at stake.
To Brexit or Remain, the question preoccupying Britain. An informal opinion poll at this London Trade Symposium was overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the European Union. But what's really at stake depends on which side you ask.
The single thing that's most at stake is democracy. If you look around the world, democracy equals prosperity and freedom. The EU is becoming increasingly undemocratic.
You're the founder of Innocent Smoothies, the biggest juice brand in Europe. What for you is most at stake in this referendum?
The EU is a big, fat opportunity for any UK business. The idea that we want to turn around and poke our biggest customer in the eye, it just fails the most basic common sense test.
Would you like a referendum sticker? Sorry, I'm on. Okay. Would you like a sticker for the referendum?
And so to the campaign on the streets, where volunteers are drumming up support for both sides, and the great British public is at loggerheads with itself.
What's your reason?
Why don't we come out, see what it's like, if it's any good, stay out, and if not, we'll come back in.
And then you'd probably have to join the euro, you wouldn't get any opt-outs.
In support of Remain, what do people say?
They range from, it's terrifying, to, you know, it's a balance of arguments. On the one hand, the economy. On the other hand, it would be good to have more control. But, you know, taking a balanced view, I'm voting in.
So is it fear-based, do you think, the idea of staying in?
To some people, it's fear-based. And to some, it's more idealistic.
I am voting to leave.
To leave? Oh, well, I'll agree with you then. Okay, that's what we're going to do, vote to leave.
So my fear of leaving the EU is that actually, if we were left in the hands of the current government and we didn't have the EU, would things be a lot worse?
But,
probably.
okay, I doubt it. That this is where you and I are going to differ. This is what lives were given up for during the First and Second World War. This is what people right across the world today are fighting for. Democracy. Are we prepared to sign it away?
Different visions of Britain's future, different versions of its past, and a not so simple choice ahead. Jonah Hull for Counting the Cost, London.
Well, here's the first of our guests on this Brexit special of Counting the Cost, and he's someone who knows more about the scenario than most. After all, before Brexit, there was Grexit, the possibility of Greece leaving the Eurozone, if not the whole union itself. Here is the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, who spoke to me from Athens earlier in the week.
One of the tragedies of this referendum campaign is that both sides have exaggerated the extent to which they can look into the future and assess the economic impact of a potential Brexit. Both sides have been making wild allegations based on statistical analysis that really is not worth the paper it's written on. My view is that on the 23rd of June, if the British people decide in their majority to leave the European Union, the immediate repercussions will be just temporary in the stock exchange, perhaps a slight devaluation of the English pound, which actually is not going to be a bad thing for the current account deficit of that country. And nothing much after that. What matters is the medium to long-term impact. Because once Brexit has been voted in, if it does get voted in, then there's going to be a long, protracted at least 2-year-long period of organizing the disentanglement, probably towards something like the Norwegian model. The greatest threat to the European and indeed to the global economic equilibrium, or disequilibrium as it may be, concerns the effect that Brexit will have on the politics of Europe and the way in which, in my estimation, Brexit would accelerate the disintegration of the Eurozone and the European Union. And that is significantly influencing or potentially influencing the ways in which the deflationary forces in Europe can impact very negatively the global economy.
Mr. Varoufakis, I want to go back to the point you made about how both campaigns have laid out their arguments. It might be too much to say they've been wild in their accusations, but there has been a lot of scaremongering on both sides. How do you think that affects the psyche of the electorate? Again, with your experience of what you saw in Greece when there are hard times or people are fearful about an uncertain future, how does it play into which way that they're going to vote?
Well, on the one hand, you have a united front amongst Brussels bureaucrats, the powers that be in France and Germany, almost throughout Europe, with David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, presenting to the British people an image of a Britain after Brexit that resembles a calamity. That is very disingenuous on the part of the Remain campaign. Because what I think is essential, and our audience needs to focus on that, is that there is a great deal of discontent in England, not in Britain, but in England, against the local ruling class, against Westminster, Whitehall, the bureaucracy in London, and of course the whole bureaucracy in the European Union. We must understand that this is an English question. Scotland and Wales are quite clear on their views. They want to remain in the European Union. The backlash comes from the British working class, on the one hand, which feels that it has become disenfranchised within its own country. Remember, the Scots and the Welsh have their own assemblies or parliament. The English don't. And it is the English ruling class, or part of that ruling class, that demands sovereignty back in order to reclaim its authority over Britain. So you have this very interesting unholy alliance between disenfranchised blue-collar workers, a part of the British ruling class aristocracy that want to reclaim their right to rule over Britain without having to talk to Brussels about it. And there is also a part of the left that has been sick and tired of neoliberalism since the years of Mrs. Thatcher, since the 1980s, and see the European Union as another vehicle for imposing neoliberalism. This is a rather dynamic mix which does not respond well to the Armageddon prognosis of the establishment.
And there'll be more from Yanis Varoufakis on next week's programme. We spent a great deal of our time discussing the wider European economic problems, which of course have his country, Greece, at the centre of them. That'll be our feature interview next week on Counting the Cost. Let's get back to the Brexit, though. Our entire programme is devoted to it this week. And a feature of any election or referendum is when the political leaders face the voters. Here's what happened when Prime Minister David Cameron laid out his vision for staying in the EU alongside UKIP party leader Nigel Farage, who strongly backs the Leave campaign. Barnaby Phillips looks at that.
Days before the referendum that could shape Britain's destiny for decades to come. Rival politicians before a live audience. First up, Nigel Farage of the UK Independence Party, whose political career has been built around the cause of getting Britain out of the EU, which he describes as a failed organisation.
The project doesn't work. I want us to get back our independence, but to say we'll be good Europeans. We'll trade with Europe, cooperate with Europe, but govern ourselves. And I believe when we do that, the rest of Europe will do that too. And a happy Europe will be a democratic Europe of sovereign states who are good neighbours in the same street. That's where I want to get us to.
Thank you very much indeed.
But Mr Farage, who says Britain should leave the EU so that it can control immigration, came under feisty attack.
You are going to increase the fear and discrimination of black British people through your anti-immigration rhetoric.
If we have an Australian-style point system, rather than an open door to 508 million people, then actually it'll be better for black people coming into Britain who currently find it very difficult because we have this open door.
Then came the Prime Minister, David Cameron. He doesn't love the EU, as he repeatedly told us, but he does think Britain gets the benefits of membership without many of the disadvantages.
I think we do have a special status in the EU already. We're not in the euro, we've got our own currency. We're not in the no-border zone, we've kept our own borders. We're now going to be out of the ever-closer union proposal, so our membership is right for Britain. It gives us the trade, it gives us the cooperation, it helps us work with other countries to get what we want.
And the Prime Minister argued Britain's interests, its global influence, are best served by staying in.
And we don't enhance our influence by walking away or quitting, we reduce our influence. So it might give you the illusion of sovereignty to withdraw on June the 23rd, but you'd find out in area after area after area, things that affect our great country, we would have no say over.
This event didn't have a clear winner. There was no standout moment that will define the campaign. So the vicious fighting here at Westminster between and within political parties will continue. But are the British public engaging with any of this? Well, hundreds of thousands of new voters have registered in the past few days. So perhaps one message is getting through, that this referendum matters an awful lot to Britain's future.
So those are the for and against arguments of the politicians. We're going to line up our two guests now on opposite sides of the argument, starting with Patrick Minford. He's a professor of applied economics at Cardiff Business School, also the former economic advisor to the late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. There have been more and more polls recently showing a bit of a swing towards the Leave scenario, Patrick, and I'm sure that sort of thing cheers you. But tell me how much weight you actually give to these polls. Remember a year ago, the general election, the pollsters got it so wrong.
When you do general elections, you know a lot about all the electors and you can stratify the sample and know how different groups will vote, given that you sampled a particular type of person. Unfortunately, they have no idea in this about how the various types of people would vote on this issue. So they're just using random sampling. And of course, as we know, the standard errors on these random samples, pure random samples on such a huge population is absolutely massive.
So herein lies the problem. It's not just the polling, it's the economic data, the theories and the models. Nothing is based on any precedent because obviously no one's ever left the EU before. Therefore, isn't everything inherently based on crystal ball gazing?
A lot of the main modeling groups, the Treasury and the international groups like the OECD and also our own domestic groups like Pricewaterhouse, Coopers and Oxford Economics, they've all kind of made the same assumption about Brexit, that it would mean the EU putting barriers on us when we leave, like it puts on the rest of the world, trade barriers. And then they've assumed that we would put trade barriers on the rest of the world as well. Much we've done is said, no, what we do when we leave the EU is we get rid of all this protectionism, full stop. We go to global free trade, unilaterally, you know, because we're a small country. What if we put up barriers to the rest of the world? It harms us. This is bad. It's not. It's better for us as a country to be global free trader.
Okay, then let me give you some numbers to counter that. This is a government treasury analysis report. I'm sure you've heard it all before, but there's talk of a year-long recession, 820,000 jobs lost in 2 years, the pound falling 12%, unemployment rising. Do you contend that those numbers are simply wrong, or they're just overblown, or what?
Well, it's what I've just said. They make this assumption, you see, that we go to less free trade as a result of Brexit, which is just the opposite of what Brexit is supposed to do. And so, you see, if you make it more expensive for your exporters in Europe, which is reducing free trade, but you also don't use the opportunity of leaving Europe to get rid of all the European protectionism, which is very big, then, of course, you're worsening your situation. And that's what the Treasury has assumed, you see. And so, of course, they get terrible results because they make that assumption. They plug that long-term effect, which is a big reduction of GDP long-term, about 8%, back into their short-term model. People know that this is going to happen. It's called rational expectations, which is pretty routine these days across all these models. And so they react badly by cutting spending. And then they add on to that what they call uncertainty about policy, which worsens the effect. And so they get what you've just talked about. But according to our calculations, the economy is 4% better off in the long term. And then on top of that, you can get rid of all this EU regulation and have a much more, free market regulatory environment in the UK, which gives you more gains.
Patrick Minford, we thank you very much for your perspective. And here's the other perspective now with Thomas Sampson. He's an assistant professor at the London School of Economics. Are you simply defending the status quo, or do you subscribe to David Cameron's theory of staying in a reformed EU?
From an economic perspective, the most important aspect of Brexit would be that we'd likely leave the single market. Now, being part of the single market makes it easier for UK businesses to export to the European Union, and it makes it cheaper for UK consumers to buy goods that are produced in the rest of Europe. And that's important because about half our trade is with the European Union. The EU is by far the UK's largest trade partner. So being part of the single market stimulates that trade, and that makes the UK better off. And if we were to leave the European Union and leave the single market, inevitably living standards in the UK would decline.
9 times out of 10, and this is an economics show, so I would say that, but 9 times out of 10, the economy is the number one issue. Do you feel that the British public agrees with and understands that, or does the more emotive issues of borders and migrants, does that trump the economic one?
So I think there are two key issues in this campaign. One is the economy and how leaving the EU would affect living standards. And the other is sovereignty and the extent to which the UK has control over its own decisions. Now, being a member of the EU inevitably does mean pooling some sovereignty and agreeing to cooperate with our European partners on some issues. So I think the key trade-off voters face is, there is an economic price to leaving the European Union, but is that a price that they're prepared to pay in order to get increased control over decision-making and to have some decisions which are currently made in Brussels be made at Westminster?
How do you calculate that price, though, when you talk there about the price of leaving the European Union? This is one of the big problems with any argument in that we just don't know. I've said this before, there's no precedent. So how do you go about calculating that price?
You're totally right that there is a lot of uncertainty over exactly what the economic cost would be. And partly that's simply because we don't know exactly what would come after Brexit. It's not that there's a well-defined alternative that we'll adopt if we were to leave the European Union. So, one reason for the range of estimates of the effects of Brexit you see is people are modelling different scenarios. Are we going to be like Norway and be part of the European Economic Area, or be part like Switzerland, which is integrated with the EU in some areas or not, and not others? Or simply trade with the rest of the EU under World Trade Organization rules. And those different post-Brexit arrangements will have different economic consequences. But if you're prepared to pick a particular arrangement, so take the WTO scenario, then you can look at how that will affect trade costs between the UK and the EU and analyse what that would mean for the UK economy. So, for example, when people look at that example of the UK trading with the rest of the world under World Trade Organization rules, typically their kind of central estimates are that this would decrease the UK's GDP per capita by around 5%.
Thomas Sampson there with his perspective on Brexit. Thomas, we thank you for your time. So what you'll no doubt appreciate by now is that every single argument is based on what may or may not happen in the future. And the future is hard to predict, kind of like a weather forecast. On the economy, most economists and large businesses favour staying in the EU, and even those who favour an exit admit growth would be affected in the short to medium term. So, using our weather forecast analogy, rain clouds predicted if there is a Brexit vote. On trade, this is where it gets a bit unclear, really. Yes, Britain would be free to establish its own trade agreements, but the head of the World Trade Organization has said leaving would present complex, unusual situations. The UK wouldn't just be able to cut and paste its formerly EU-negotiated trade deals. And with almost half of Britain's exports going to the rest of the EU, the outlook is cloudy. And on migration, well, the government says migration benefits the economy. The Leave camp say it puts too much pressure on things like the National Health Service. Recent figures do show EU migrants have been coming to the UK at near record rates. But the EU was set up on the free movement of people. So what happens to, say, Britons living in Spain, for example? Again, not much visibility there. It's a foggy outlook. Our final guest is Martin Beck, the lead UK economist with the London-based Oxford Economics. Martin, everything seems to come down to, well, a lot of it, I should say, seems to come down to the economics of it all. We get the reports. You're an economist, so you tell me, can we believe the economists, the same ones who missed the economic crisis?
Well, the difficulty we have as economists in looking at the issue of Brexit is that we don't actually have any precedent. So the UK has never left the EU in the past. No major country has ever left the EU. So we don't really have any evidence to draw on. What we can do as economists is come up with potential scenarios. So what might happen if the UK were to leave the EU? We can then consider like standard economic relationships between things like trade and investment and come to a conclusion. But it's important to bear in mind that we're not talking about evidence here. We're talking about possible states of the world we might find ourselves in if the UK left and what the economic outcome of that could be.
Tell me, though, what is your overarching belief, based on the numbers you see, based on the research you do? Where do you believe Britain should be?
Well, we're in line with the consensus, which suggests that if we left, there might be a hit to the economy. That said, we think it would be relatively modest, and it really comes down to what the British government would do if we were outside the EU. If the British government pursued policies that were pro-free trade, pro-liberalisation, if they kept up a reasonable level of migration, then the damage could be relatively small. So I think a lot of it comes down to what happens after we exit, rather than the actual process of exit.
Right. So how then has it been for you as an economist? How difficult? You talk about having to create these economic models which are not based on a precedent. As an economist, how difficult has this whole process been?
Well, it does require a lot of judgment. I mean, we have to think about what the state of the world might be if the UK left. In terms of looking at the effect of things like less trade or less investment on growth, for example, the economic literature has done a lot of work on that. There's a lot of well-established relationships between those kind of variables, so that was relatively straightforward. The challenge is really deciding what the world might look like in the event of a Brexit.
OK then, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of mum and dad in the UK. Mortgage, kids in school, steady job, but probably still worried about the way the economy's going and whether those jobs will be safe. And then they look at all this data that comes out and they get it on the news and online. How does it help them? They are listening to economic arguments about trade and business, but I'm wondering how that affects them.
I mean, it's a difficult decision to arrive at, because for every argument one can present against leaving the EU, it's possible to find a counter-argument that suggests we should leave. So, I mean, I think although the economics is important in this debate, it's not a primarily economic issue. I mean, the European Union is a political project. There's a lot of politics involved in EU membership, what you think about sovereignty and self-government and so on. So although I think economics should play some role in people's decision, then ultimately this is a political decision about where you think the UK should be politically, how you think we should be governed and so on. So I don't think economics should be the be-all and end-all of a decision.
All right, that is Martin Beck from Oxford Economics rounding out our Brexit special. Thank you, Martin. And that is it for this special edition of Counting the Cost on the EU referendum. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page with individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.